So this brings us on to the last of our six experts, called Gerard Ledoigt, probably pronounced really badly. He's a retired professor and chair of biology at the Clermont University in France, educated in chemistry and microbiology, and has been working for a long time on how plants defend themselves against harmful agents. Gerard.
Voilà, c'est bon maintenant?
Okay, can you hear me now? There we are. So thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to this. I think it's really important to have this discussion on the different modalities of the effects of 5G. I wanted to deal with a more environmental aspect, just to respond to the three questions that have been asked. On the radio frequency, we have a number of examples. These radio frequencies have an important effect on the environment. As indicated previously, the effects were perhaps already in place before 5G. Now, with regard to pollinating, the bees have been seriously affected after 25 to 40 minutes exposure to a mobile phone, and there really was a great deal of disturbance to bee behaviour, and there was also a reduction in activity observed in the hives. Other organisms such as plants that were exposed to 48 hours of mobile phone radiation, well, we saw an increase in chromosome anomalies, different also cellular fragmentation. This was the case with several different species of plants. So quite serious effects, therefore. Then there's a DNA study for Nature which shows that more than half of plant samples, after 2 or 3 weeks of exposure, 0.4 to 1 volt, they showed a great sensitivity to the radiation, and this was also the case for various numbers of animals and various breeds of animals. We talked about exposure to 1 volt. Now, tomato plants. This was part of the scientific work that I was doing in Clermont-Ferrand. Tomato plants were exposed to a frequency of 2.5 megahertz for 10 minutes. And during that time, it was a very short time, but we saw that plants responded with trauma after 10 minutes. So this proved that this simulation made a change to the molecules, and there was a very specific response which was clearly linked to the exposure to the radiation. But we didn't see any athermic effects of radiofrequency on plants. There were specific reactions in the plants and then also to animals. And we're talking about 900 megahertz. So we tried to measure the accumulation of effects to use studies to see what the difference was for the cells in plants. Well, what we found was there was mobilization in plant cellular development. The response of the organism to exposure resulted in a transfer of trauma which changed the physiological makeup. Hormones had changed, etc. And this depended on the propagation of the signal, and the reception is also important. This is a fundamental point if we are to develop receptors. Response to radio frequencies is important because it has given rise to stress, and we have seen that there is a short 10-minute radiation and a small intensity. And then you look at it, a longer exposure to greater radiation, and you see quite a difference in response. Given the health impact, I think that there is a lot of literature around to show that there is a risk to health, particularly if exposure is for a long period. And the study highlights that, however, some of the results are below the levels set, but pregnant women and children are more vulnerable. And many other people have reported these findings. Living organisms, however, do not have the same sensitivity to the waves. Our studies have shown that tumors, brain tumors, have been discovered when there is long-term exposure to foam waves. So there has also been a significant increase in terms of brain tumors if these electronic waves are prevalent. A group of experts has shown that the statistical analysis has been well carried out and the research is robust. Looking at the excessive risks of cancer amongst phone users and experimental studies on radio frequencies and cancerogenicity, it does show a cause-effect relationship. In conclusion to my remarks, let me just say that it's been experimentally shown robustly and without fear of contradiction that these frequencies will interfere with the physiology of plants, their metabolism, the function of proteins, their fundamental tools for life, the genome structure. All of these elements are important for them to store life. So there is an inflammation of the tissues affected, and the accumulation of these active types of oxygen mean that the genes that are part of development of human diseases such as cancer are also affected here. And I think that the electromagnetic fields do have a significant effect. Every organ, every tissue is affected. And with regard to environmental pollutions, there is a symmetry between the EMFs and the negative effects caused. So I think that we cannot just say that it's about a change of temperature. That is not really what it's about. But in the future, we will be looking at evaluations of based on thermic factors, and that means that a lot of scientific data is being left out of the equation, and that data would show that there have been nefarious effects of exposure to these rays. The toxicity rate is also linked to stress. Exposure to radioactive waves does lead to an increase in stress. It affects and damages the DNA structure, leading to fewer sperm. And in terms of radio frequencies, the levels are below the maximum permitted levels, but the sperm quality is significantly reduced. during the prenatal period, exposure to 900 megahertz produces stress in tissues and also with regard to the progenitor of the animals that are exposed. Organ damage, liver, etc. Can be damaged in newborns. And this is because of the stress to the organism, and it can give rise to various physiological problems. DNA is affected, and it has been shown in various studies that after exposure, it's not because of the thermic exposure. There are various other factors involved. The DNA changes have also been observed, and this has led to an epigenetic response, and this is linked to the type of radiofrequency. Following the exposure to radiofrequencies, it has been described by various teams of studies that the formation of small clusters and tumours could have resulted, and the genotoxic issues are important. The cellular division is changed. Having said that, all of this depends on the type of signal to which an organism is exposed. Now, in terms of the capacity of cells to repair DNA damage, this can be affected by exposure. Trying to repair DNA requires a process, and if this can't happen, then cancerous effects can result. And this can lead to progress in further cancers and can lead to neurodegenerative diseases also in the organisms. In terms of 5G in the system to be implemented, we can see that proteins which cause stress are present, and the cellular membranes are also affected. So we have these experimental studies which have shown non-thermic effects. So there's really not a great depth of penetration into the organism by the exposure or by the waves. But nevertheless, this can lead to a serious physiological change or damage on the immune system, the heart and the brain, the nervous system also for plants and other organisms. And this is in response to 5G. So a lot of the proteins identified are inflamed because of stress. For instance, also, if there's an exposure to 60 gigahertz, the maximum permitted levels are reached. And the number of genes is affected also. Genes are modified, and this shows that probably an organic response is being produced. Genotoxicity that is linked to this level of exposure is important. And we have found these negative effects in rats. Prenatal effects in mice and rats shows that the newborn are also affected. In conclusion, let me say that the 5th generation of the 5G can cause serious difficulties. There are potential risks for human health and for the environment. And there needs to be a necessary moratorium which will allow us to reflect on what we want to do. We also need to develop research which is fully independent from any pressure groups in this area. And the creation of new teams needs to happen based on public funding. Thank you. And I want to quote Michel Montaigne, who said that curiosity is extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. That was very useful as well. So a quick summary of 4 or 5 key points from this section will be helpful, I think. The first is that the ICNIRP evaluation and its exposure limits mainly focus on health and not environment. That, as we've heard, secondly, the radio frequencies will interfere with the chemistry and biology of all life forms, and often at exposure levels below the ICNIRP limits. But the 3, the beam forming or concentration of the 5G network that Arnos pointed out will hopefully leave a lot of non-users not exposed, though users might be more exposed. And it's worth just reminding people, in the boxes of your laptops and your phones, the manufacturers say, keep the phone at least 2-3 centimeters away from direct contact on the head or any other part of the body, and for laptops 20 centimeters away, for obvious reasons. That overall the evidence, as with health, is perhaps not convincing, but it certainly seems concerning. And the question is, how much strength of evidence do policymakers wait for before taking action to reduce serious threats of harm? That's enough from me. Now we'll turn to the perhaps more difficult area of handling some questions. I have had prior notification from at least 3 MEPs who wanted to ask a question. So if they're there, I hope they are, I'll ask first of all Eva Kiley to put her question.
Hi, thank you, and congratulations for not just moderating this amazing event, but giving us so much data and making excellent conclusions. And I want to thank Michel Rivasi and